For centuries, the Romans had waged wars against other peoples of Italy. Those taken prisoner were turned into slaves. Some of these slaves ended up in the city of Populonia on the northern coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea, where metal was smelted from ore brought by ships from the island of Ilva, now called Elba. What did I know about iron before all this happened? I had seen axes in the hands of woodcutters and marveled at the strength of the metal that could split mighty oaks. The shears used once a year to clip our sheep were also made of iron. Once, they let me hold them. They felt cold and unpleasant to the touch. An older shepherd once told me that iron was dug from the earth. I imagined a giant cave, like the one where we drove sheep during winter cold spells. In the depths of this cave, giants worked day and night, hammering at hard iron walls. Maybe that's why the earth trembled from time to time. When I turned 16, I knew no more about iron than the savages from the shores of the distant northern sea, where waves wash up pieces of yellow amber. I had grown up in the Ciminian forests, which in those days were considered impenetrable. Few dared venture deep into those thickets, fearing wild beasts and bandits. But the Romans, insatiable in their lust for wealth and power, ignored the danger and pushed deep into the Ciminian woods. The attack was so sudden that the warriors who were in the city couldn't reach us in time. The elders of the Umbrian villages ordered all young shepherds and woodcutters to gather. From that day forward, iron in my mind became associated with the gleam of Roman armor and helmets, with the serpentine whistle of javelins and spears. The shepherds fled, abandoning their staffs and slings. Iron smelled of blood. I remembered that smell well, because I carried a wounded shepherd on my shoulders. The point of a Roman javelin had lodged so deep under his shoulder blade that it could barely be pulled out. The shepherd died afterward. I looked at the blood-stained piece of metal with hatred and disgust. The Romans captured me in a hut when I thought I was safe. They put chains on my legs so I couldn't escape, driving me with sticks. They led me across the entire country to the sea. I saw nothing around me. Everything was like a fog. I felt only the weight of iron and the pain in my legs, rubbed raw and bleeding. I was freed from the chains on the ship. They removed them before shoving me into the hold, where there were already many prisoners like me. I couldn't see their faces, but I heard groans and choked on the smell of their bodies. From their speech, I understood they were fellow countrymen, Umbrians, like myself. Mark my words, someone whispered softly. They're taking us to Populonia. No, another responded in horror. Anywhere but there. The invisible waves rubbed and scraped against the hull like sheep. Rubbing my swollen ankles, I remembered the pines that propped up the sky with their tops, the smell of rotting leaves, grass, and campfires. After hours spent in the suffocating air below, the sea breeze seemed surprisingly fresh and fragrant to me. I breathed it in deeply and couldn't understand why the other prisoners were so distressed. They were frightened by the columns of smoke rising from behind the harbor hills. Populonia, they groaned behind me. I looked around. I wanted to ask what made Populonia more terrible than other places. Wasn't it all the same where one served as a slave? But a sailor struck me and pushed me toward the ladder. Along the sandy shore, people with sacks on their shoulders walked from ships anchored in a row. They emptied the contents of their sacks onto carts and again walked silently and gloomily toward the docks. Why are they carrying earth on ships? I wondered, but no longer asked questions. The man who approached me could easily have been a demon from the underworld, the kind priests used to frighten peasants, sharp-nosed, with face and hands as if blackened in the flames of Hades. "Hey there, newcomer." The demon addressed me. "You wouldn't happen to be from Koza, would you?" I shook my head. "I'm from the Ciminian forests. I'm looking for a fellow countryman," the soot-covered man explained. "How are my people doing?" Now, I was walking along a dusty road with those who had been brought with me on the ship. The bushes around were not green like those in my forest, but gray and black. The sharp-peaked hills rising behind the bushes were the same color, resembling burial mounds in appearance. This didn't frighten me. I understood that the soot and ash from gigantic fires, which I had seen from the ship, covered faces, trees, and earth alike. Around the bend in the road, a hill became visible with crimson flames bursting from its peak. Half-naked people ran around the hill, One might think they were performing a sacred dance in honor of the fire god, but looking closer, I realized this wasn't a dance. Some held shovels and were digging channels with them. Others dragged boxes and placed them under the fiery stream flowing from the hill. The stream was so unbearably bright that I involuntarily squinted. Who would have thought that this was molten iron, from which axes, swords, and chains are made, and the earth being stuffed into sacks and carried from ships was ore. It was brought from the island of Ilva, lying opposite Populonia, and smelted in furnaces. I learned all this on my very first day. The overseer gave me a shovel and forced me to scatter burned ore, which they called slag. The sharp-peaked hills I had seen on the road from the harbor were also made of slag. While working, I observed everything happening around me. I saw mountains of charcoal and guessed that charcoal burned in the furnaces along with the ore. It was probably made somewhere in the mountains. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. I wasn't mistaken. The charcoal came from forests that could be seen beyond the burning furnaces. But I also discovered something else. That first day, the ones who worked closest to the blazing furnaces were slaves. Their bodies and faces were covered in scars and burns. No one lasted more than a year here. Those who remained alive became as weak as children. Iron. Now I knew everything about it. I had reached the source of this sinister metal. Before becoming an axe, sword, or chain, iron was ore and charcoal. Exhaustion that breaks the entire body. An iron stream that blinds the eyes. The whistle of whips. Pits where the dead are thrown. Escape. Escape. This thought never left me. It was burned in golden letters in my brain, and in the dreams that visited me from time to time, I saw myself fleeing or hiding, in search of escape routes. I began trying to get acquainted with other iron slaves. There were talkative Gauls and gloomy Ligurians, quick Greeks and slow Sardinians. Fearing conspiracy, the owners of the furnaces preferred to keep people of different tribes together. I managed to notice that the slaves were led by a red-haired Gaul, nicknamed Cyclops. A drop of molten iron had burned out his left eye. Several times I tried to attract Cyclops' attention, but he pretended not to notice me. Being constantly among the Gauls, I gradually learned to understand their language. One night I heard a whisper. Our salvation lies not in our legs, but in iron. These words seemed incomprehensible to me, and at first I decided that I simply didn't know the foreign language well enough yet. But after thinking about it, I guessed that the speaker meant not the iron we were smelting, but weapons made of iron. In the morning I approached Cyclops and addressed him in his language. I'm an Umbrian, and you're a Gaul. We're both slaves. Don't avoid me. I could be useful to you. This time too. Cyclops pushed me away, apparently fearing that I was a spy for the overseers. But that very evening he came to me himself, and, looking into my eyes, asked, "Are you ready to endure the trial by fire?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "Then come." We stopped near a furnace. The Gaul had a stick with an iron tip in his hands. He dipped its end into the fiery stream and immediately pressed the point to my shoulder. I clenched my teeth to keep from screaming. "Now repeat after me. May I burn in flames if I betray my friends." Cyclops removed the iron before I finished speaking these words. "Now, you are our brother," he said, embracing me. "Our secrets are your secrets." Cyclops strode across heaps of slag, jumping over channels. I could barely keep up with him. Something black loomed ahead. It was an old abandoned furnace. Tufts of grass and stems with still closed heads peeked out from its walls on all sides. Life was celebrating victory over the dead monster, crawling and scratching our hands and faces. We brothers crept through the opening from which molten metal had once poured. Cyclops reached for something. A metallic ringing was heard. "Take it," he called to me, passing some object. It was a crude homemade sword, but I didn't feel it was heavy. I gripped the iron handle, knowing I wouldn't let go of it until I won my freedom. "Listen carefully," Cyclops whispered. "We've been preparing for a long time. There are 43 of us sworn brothers scattered among all the work gangs. When the time comes, We'll strike simultaneously. When will that be? Soon. The Romans are sending a new shipment of slaves from the north. When they arrive, the guards will be distracted with organizing the new workers. That's when we'll act. I felt my heart pounding. After months of despair, hope was finally within reach. What's the plan? We'll seize weapons from the guard posts, free as many slaves as we can, and fight our way to the ships in the harbor. If we can capture even one vessel. But there are hundreds of Roman soldiers in Populonia. Most are away on campaign, and those who remain won't expect slaves to fight back with real weapons instead of shovels and hammers. Cyclops pointed to various hiding spots throughout the abandoned furnace where weapons had been concealed. Besides swords, there were spears, knives, and even a few pieces of armor salvaged and repaired in secret. How long have you been preparing this? 2 years. Every piece of metal we could steal. Every weapon we could make in the dark. Hours before dawn. Some of our brothers have died in the furnaces before seeing this day. But their sacrifice won't be in vain. The red-haired Gaul's single eye gleamed with fierce determination in the darkness. Tomorrow. Watch for the signal. When you see smoke rising from the eastern hill, not the usual furnace smoke, but a thin white column, you'll know the new slaves have arrived. By nightfall, we'll be free men, or dead ones. We crawled back out into the night air. The stars above seemed brighter than I remembered from my days in the Ciminian forests. Perhaps it was because they now carried the promise of freedom. The next day passed slowly. I went through the motions of my work, shoveling slag and hauling ore, but my eyes kept drifting to the eastern hills. Other slaves in my work gang seemed unusually quiet too. I wondered how many of them were part of the conspiracy. The overseer, a brutal man named Marcus, who took pleasure in beating slaves who worked too slowly, seemed to sense something was different. He prowled among us more frequently than usual, his whip ready, but he couldn't pinpoint what had changed. "You lazy dogs work like you're half dead today," he snarled, striking one of the Sardinian slaves across the back. "Maybe a few lashes will wake you up." I forced myself to work faster, to appear normal. The sword hidden in the abandoned furnace seemed to call to me, but I had to wait for the signal. Finally, just after midday, I saw it, a thin white column of smoke rising from the eastern hill, different from the thick black smoke that constantly poured from the furnaces. The new slaves had arrived. Now all we had to do was survive until nightfall. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Every moment seemed to last an eternity as I waited for darkness to fall. The furnaces roared with their usual fury, sending cascades of sparks into the afternoon sky. But beneath the familiar sounds of hammering and bellowing, I could sense a different energy among the slaves, a tension that crackled like lightning before a storm. As evening approached, I noticed the Roman guards were indeed distracted. Several wagons had arrived carrying the new slaves from the northern territories. The guards were busy organizing them, checking their chains, and assigning them to work gangs. It was exactly as Cyclops had predicted. I caught glimpses of the newcomers as they were marched past our work area. They looked as I must have looked when I first arrived. Confused, terrified, overwhelmed by the hellish landscape of Populonia. Some were barely more than boys. Others were grizzled veterans of previous Roman campaigns. All shared the same hollow look of men who had lost everything. One of the new arrivals caught my eye. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a warrior despite his chains. His eyes swept across the industrial nightmare surrounding us, taking in every detail with the calculating gaze of someone already planning his next move. When our eyes met briefly, I saw something there that reminded me of Cyclops. A flame that captivity hadn't yet extinguished. "Back to work, you dogs," Marcus the Overseer shouted, cracking his whip in the air. "The furnaces don't rest, and neither do you." I bent over my shovel, but my mind was elsewhere. Soon the sun would set behind the western hills. Soon the signal would come. As twilight deepened, I saw other slaves beginning to position themselves strategically around the work area. They moved casually, as if simply going about their regular duties, but I could see the pattern. We were spreading out to cover all the key points. The weapons storage, the main gate, The guard towers. A Ligurian slave named Brutus worked his way closer to where I stood. He was one of the strongest men in the furnaces, able to lift iron ingots that would normally require 2 men. His scarred hands gripped a hammer as he pretended to shape a piece of hot metal. "Ready, brother?" he whispered in broken Latin. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky the color of molten iron. The moment was almost here. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The blast of a Roman war horn echoed across the hills, but this wasn't the signal we were waiting for. This was something else entirely. "What's happening?" I asked Brutus, but he looked as confused as I felt. Our answer came within minutes. A messenger on horseback came galloping down the road from the east. His mount lathered with sweat. He reined up at the main gate and began shouting to the guards. "Gauls! A war band of Gauls is attacking the northern settlements! They're only 2 days' march from here." My heart sank. Our carefully laid plans were about to be destroyed by pure chance. If there were Gallic warriors nearby, the Romans would be on high alert. Extra guards would be called in. Our window of opportunity was closing. But then I saw Cyclops emerge from the shadows near the abandoned furnace. His face was grim, but his eye burned with determination. He raised his hand and made a quick gesture. The signal we'd been waiting for. It was now, or never. The attack began at 3 points. Simultaneously, Cyclops and a group of Gauls rushed the main weapon storage. Brutus and his team charged the guard tower nearest the harbor. A third group, led by a Greek named Alexios, struck at the overseer's quarters where additional weapons were kept. I ran toward the abandoned furnace where our hidden weapons waited. My hands shook as I grabbed the crude sword and a spear. The metal felt warm in my grip, as if it had absorbed the heat from all the fires around us. Shouts and screams filled the air. The clash of metal on metal rang out as our people fought with stolen swords against the Romans' professional weapons. Some of the new slaves, still in chains, began cheering when they realized what was happening. "Death to Rome!" someone shouted in Gallic. "Freedom!" cried another voice in Greek. I rushed back toward the main battle. Near the weapon storage, Cyclops was dueling with Marcus, the overseer. The brutal Roman had somehow acquired a sword and was pressing the one-eyed Gaul hard. Marcus was skilled with a blade, but Cyclops fought with the fury of years of oppression. "You'll die for this, slave!" Marcus snarled as their swords locked. "We were already dead," Cyclops replied. "Now we choose how to die." I wanted to help him, but Brutus called out from near the guard tower. "The gates! We need to take the gates!" If we couldn't control the entrances to the compound, Roman reinforcements would trap us here. I changed direction and ran toward the main gate, where 2 guards were trying to bar the heavy wooden doors. "Stop them!" one of the guards shouted as he saw me approaching. I raised my spear and charged. The guard drew his sword just in time to parry my thrust, but I was fighting for my life and my freedom. The Roman was fighting for his job. The difference in motivation showed immediately. My spear point found the gap in his armor just below the ribs. He dropped his sword and fell to his knees, clutching the wound. The second guard took one look at his fallen comrade and ran. "The gate is ours," I shouted, but our victory was short-lived. Even as we secured key positions around the compound, I could see torches moving on the roads leading to Populonia. Word of our uprising was spreading, and Roman soldiers were responding faster than we'd hoped. "We need to reach the ships now," Cyclops called out. He had defeated Marcus, but he was wounded. Blood flowed from a cut on his sword arm. "What about the others?" I asked, pointing to the slaves who were still fighting throughout the compound. "Those who can come will come. Those who can't." He didn't finish the sentence, but we both knew what he meant. Freedom was within our grasp, but it would cost us dearly. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. The battle for our freedom had begun, but the cost was already mounting. As we fought our way toward the harbor, I could see bodies scattered throughout the compound, both Roman and slave. The furnaces continued to burn, casting an eerie red glow over the carnage. "Stay together!" Cyclops shouted, as our group of maybe 20 surviving rebels made their way down the hill toward the ships. "The Romans will try to cut us off before we reach the water." He was right. Even in the darkness, I could see soldiers moving to block our path to the harbor. They carried torches and moved in organized formations. These weren't the regular guards, but trained legionnaires who had responded to the alarm. Behind us, the compound was in chaos. Some slaves had joined our rebellion, while others cowered in their barracks, too frightened or broken to fight. A few had even taken up weapons to defend their Roman masters, hoping to earn better treatment. It sickened me to see fellow slaves fighting against their own freedom. But years of bondage had crushed the spirit out of many men. "Look!" Brutus pointed ahead to the docks. "The ships!" 3 vessels were moored at the wooden pier. 2 were small coastal traders, but the third was a larger galley that could carry us far from Roman territory if we could capture it. The problem was getting to it alive. "Spears!" someone shouted. A volley of Roman javelins whistled through the air. I threw myself to the ground as the deadly points struck all around us. One of our Greek brothers cried out as a spear took him in the chest. He stumbled and fell, his blood dark against the pale sand. "We have to charge," Cyclops declared. "If we hesitate, they'll surround us." It was madness, but it was our only chance. We rose from the ground as one and ran screaming toward the Roman line. My crude sword felt light in my hands as I closed the distance to the nearest soldier. The Roman was young, probably not much older than myself. His armor was polished and his sword was sharp. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw fear. He had trained for battle, but he had never faced men fighting for their very souls. My blade caught him across the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. I should have finished him, but something made me hesitate. Perhaps it was the look of terror on his face. The same look I'd worn when the Romans first captured me. That moment of mercy nearly cost me my life. Another legionnaire came at me from the side, his sword aimed at my ribs. Only Brutus's intervention saved me. The big Ligurian's hammer caught the Roman in the head with a sickening crunch. "No time for pity," Brutus growled as we continued our charge toward the ships. The fighting was fierce but brief. The Romans were professionals, but we had desperation on our side. One by one, the soldiers fell back or fell dead until we had broken through to the docks. "The galley," Cyclops pointed to the largest ship. "Can anyone here sail?" "I can," said the tall newcomer I'd noticed earlier. Up close, I could see he was a Celt from somewhere far north. His accent was strange, but his Latin was good. "My people are fishermen and raiders. I know ships." "What's your name, brother?" "Bran. And you?" "Cyclops. This is our fight now. Can we count on you?" Bran looked at the ship, then at the Roman torches moving toward us through the city. "I've been a slave for 3 moons. 3 moons too long." We boarded the galley in desperate haste. Some of our group began cutting the mooring lines while others searched for weapons and supplies. The ship was well stocked for a long voyage. Water barrels, dried meat, and sacks of grain filled the hold. "Bran," Cyclops called. "How long to get this ship moving?" "Give me 20 men on the oars, and we'll be gone before the Romans know what happened." But the Romans were already organizing their response. Torches were moving toward the other ships at the dock, and I could hear officers shouting orders. They meant to follow us, or burn the remaining vessels so we couldn't return. "There," I pointed to movement on the shore. "They're bringing archers." A line of Roman bowmen was taking position along the waterfront. If they started shooting, we'd be trapped on the ship with nowhere to hide. "Cut the last line," Bran shouted from his position at the steering oar. "Everyone to the oars, now." The first arrows began to fall, just as we pushed away from the dock. Most splashed harmlessly into the water, but one caught Alexios in the shoulder. The Greek gritted his teeth and kept rowing. "Faster," Cyclops urged. "We're almost out of range." The galley gained speed as we coordinated our rowing. I had never worked an oar before, but the motion was similar to wielding a hammer at the furnaces. Pull, release, pull, release. The rhythm became hypnotic as we fought for distance from the shore. Behind us, Populonia was in flames, whether by accident or design. The fires had spread from the furnaces to other buildings in the compound. Orange light danced across the water, and I could smell smoke even out here on the sea. "Where do we go now?" I asked Cyclops as the immediate danger passed. The one-eyed Gaul looked out at the dark water stretching endlessly before us. "Away from Rome. North, maybe, to Gaul, or west to Hispania. Somewhere they'll never find us. And then what? We can't go home. They'll be watching for us there. Then we make new homes," Bran said from his place at the steering oar. "Free homes." As dawn broke over the Tyrrhenian Sea, I realized I was no longer a slave. The iron chains were gone from my body. And though I carried scars that would never heal, my spirit was my own again. But freedom, I was learning, was not an ending. It was a beginning. And the hardest battles were still ahead of us. 3 days out from Populonia, our stolen galley cut through Mediterranean swells under a blazing Sunday. The initial euphoria of our escape had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of life as fugitive slaves. We had food for perhaps 2 weeks if we rationed carefully, and water for maybe 10 days. More importantly, we had no clear destination. "We can't stay at sea forever," Brutus said during one of our evening councils. "This ship needs repairs, and we need supplies. Rome has allies and trading partners throughout the Mediterranean. They'll be watching for us." I looked around at our small band of survivors. We had started with over 40 men in the rebellion, but only 18 had made it to the ship. Now we were down to 16. We'd lost Alexios to infection from his arrow wound, and another man had simply vanished during the night. Whether he'd thrown himself overboard in despair or tried to swim to shore, we'd never know. Bran, our Celtic navigator, spread out a piece of sailcloth and began drawing a rough map with charcoal. "Here's where we are," he said, marking a spot west of the Italian coast. "North takes us to Gaul, but the Roman legions are thick there. They're still fighting my people. East is Greece and Roman territory. South is Africa. What about west?" I asked. "Beyond the Pillars of Hercules? The Atlantic," Bran said grimly. "Ships that go there don't always come back. But..." He paused, studying his crude map. "There are stories. Islands out there where no Roman has ever set foot. Places where a man could be truly free. Stories," Cyclops spat. "We need certainty, not myths. Do we?" I found myself saying, "What certainty have we ever had? We were certain we'd die as slaves in Populonia, but here we are." The debate continued through the night, but by dawn we'd reached a decision. We would sail west to Hispania first, keeping close to the coast to avoid Roman patrols. There, we might be able to trade for supplies and find passage to more distant lands. Our first challenge came sooner than expected. On the 4th day, as we hugged the Spanish coastline, we spotted sails on the horizon. 3 ships moving in formation, flying Roman standards. "War galleys," Bran announced, after studying them through the morning haze. "Faster than us, and built for fighting. Can we outrun them?" Cyclops asked. "Not in this tub. Our best chance is to beach the ship and scatter inland." But I was studying the approaching vessels more carefully. Something about their movement seemed wrong. "Wait," I said. "Look how they're sailing. That's not a Roman formation." Bran shaded his eyes and watched the ships for several minutes. Gradually, his expression changed. "You're right. Those ships have been captured. Look at the way they're handling them. Romans would never sail in such a ragged line." As the vessels drew closer, we could see figures on their decks. They weren't wearing the standardized armor of Roman legionnaires, but rather a mixture of equipment that suggested they were pirates or rebels like ourselves. "Escaped gladiators," Cyclops said with growing excitement. "It has to be. I heard rumors before our revolt. Gladiators escaping from the games and taking to the sea." The lead ship raised a signal flag. Not a Roman standard, but a crude banner showing crossed swords. It was a message of brotherhood to fellow rebels against Rome. When the ships came alongside ours, their leader proved to be a magnificent specimen of a man, tall and powerfully built. with the scars of countless arena battles marking his bronze skin. He moved with the deadly grace of a born fighter. "I am Spartacus," he announced in accented but clear Latin. "We heard about the uprising at Populonia. You fight Rome, as do we." Cyclops stepped forward. "I'm called Cyclops. These are my brothers in rebellion. We seek safe harbor and allies against our common enemy." Spartacus smiled, and it was like watching a wolf bare its teeth. "Rome has made enemies of us all. But separately, we are insects to be crushed. Together." He gestured at the 3 captured warships. "Together we might sting like wasps." "What do you propose?" I asked. "Join us. We have a base on an island near Sardinia, far enough from Roman patrols to be safe, close enough to strike at their shipping. We need men who know the sea, and you need protection." It was an attractive offer, but I could see doubt in some of my companions' faces. Trading one form of warfare for another wasn't what they'd hoped for when we escaped. "And if we want to sail beyond the Middle Sea?" Bran asked. "To lands where Rome cannot follow? Then you'll need supplies, navigation aids, and ships that can handle ocean voyages." Spartacus replied. "We can provide all of that for those who earn them by fighting at our side." I looked at Cyclops, then at the rest of our small band. We were exhausted, running low on supplies, and had nowhere else to turn. But more than that, I found myself drawn to this gladiator's vision. We could run to the ends of the earth, but Rome would keep expanding, keep enslaving, keep crushing the spirit of free peoples. Maybe it was time to fight back instead of just running away. "How many ships do you command?" Cyclops asked. 12, with more joining us each month. Escaped slaves, bankrupt farmers, anyone with a grudge against Rome. We've taken 23 Roman vessels in the last 6 months. The numbers were impressive, but I had to ask the hard question. "And how many have you lost?" Spartacus's expression grew serious. 7 ships, nearly 200 men. This is war, not pleasure sailing. But every Roman ship we take, every cargo we capture, every slave we free, it all weakens them and strengthens us. I thought of the furnaces of Populonia, of Marcus the overseer, and his whip, of the countless slaves still suffering in Roman chains throughout the world. Then I looked at Spartacus and his scarred warriors, men who had chosen to fight rather than submit. "I'll stand with you," I said. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Even those who dreamed of distant shores understood that some battles couldn't be avoided. They could only be won or lost. "Welcome to the rebellion of the sea," Spartacus said with satisfaction. "Your first lesson begins now. We're going to teach you how to hunt Roman wolves." If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. The island base that Spartacus had established was a marvel of organization and determination. Hidden in a natural harbor between towering cliffs, it looked like nothing more than barren rock from the sea. But inside the protective walls of stone, nearly 1,000 escaped slaves had built a thriving community. "This is what freedom looks like when men work together," Spartacus explained as he gave us a tour of the settlement. "No overseers, no whips, no chains. Every man contributes what he can and takes what he needs." There were workshops where captured Roman weapons were repaired and improved, forges where new blades were hammered from stolen iron, and even a small temple where men of all nations could pray to their gods. Former gladiators trained new recruits in the art of combat, while escaped household slaves taught reading and mathematics to those who had never learned. But it was the harbor that truly impressed me. A dozen captured Roman ships bobbed at anchor, their holds converted to carry fighters instead of cargo. Each vessel flew the crossed swords banner that had become the symbol of our rebellion. "How do you keep the Romans from finding this place?" Cyclops asked as we watched crews loading weapons and supplies onto one of the galleys. "Patrols," Spartacus replied. "We have lookouts on every island within 50 miles. Any Roman ship that gets too close simply disappears. And we spread false rumors, tales of sea monsters and cursed waters that make their sailors afraid to venture into these regions." Over the following weeks, I learned the brutal mathematics of rebellion. Every victory cost lives, and every defeat cost even more. But slowly, inexorably, our numbers grew as word spread throughout the Mediterranean that there was a place where escaped slaves could find sanctuary and purpose. My first raid came a month after our arrival. A Roman merchant vessel, heavily loaded with grain bound for the capital, had been spotted by our scouts. It was defended by only a small guard detachment, an easy target for a crew hungry for both supplies and revenge. Remember, Spartacus told us as we prepared to board the enemy ship. We're not pirates. We're liberators. Kill the Romans if you must, but free their slaves. Every man we recruit is a victory that lasts. The attack itself was swift and brutal. Our galley closed with a merchant ship just after dawn, when the Roman guards were still groggy from sleep. Grappling hooks pulled the vessels together, and we swarmed aboard with weapons ready. The fighting was brief but vicious. The Roman soldiers, outnumbered 3-1, put up a desperate resistance. I found myself face to face with a young officer, barely out of his teens, who fought with the fury of desperation. "You're all dead men," he shouted as our blades locked. "Rome will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Then we'll give Rome a good chase," I replied, forcing his sword aside and striking him down. When the battle was over, we had captured a fortune in grain and gold, freed 37 slaves who had been chained in the hold, and taken the ship itself as a prize. But we had also lost 3 of our own fighters, including young Marcus, a Greek who had joined us only 2 weeks earlier. That night, as we celebrated our victory back at the base, I found myself thinking about the Roman officer I had killed. He had been someone's son, maybe someone's brother. His death would bring grief to people who had never owned a slave or profited from our suffering. But then I remembered the slaves we had freed, men who would otherwise have spent their lives in Roman chains. I thought of the furnaces of Populonia, still burning, still consuming human lives, to feed Rome's appetite for iron. Sometimes, I realized, the only choice is between being a victim or a killer. "You're thinking too much," Cyclops said, settling down beside me with a cup of wine. "I can see it in your face." "Do you ever wonder if we're becoming like them?" I asked. "The Romans, I mean, using violence to get what we want." The one-eyed Gaul was quiet for a long moment. "There's a difference," he finally said. "They use violence to enslave. We use it to free. When a man is drowning, you don't debate the ethics of throwing him a rope." As the months passed, our rebellion grew stronger. More ships joined our fleet. More escaped slaves found their way to our sanctuary. We struck at Roman shipping throughout the western Mediterranean, capturing supplies and freeing our fellow victims of empire. But Rome was not idle. Reports reached us of increased naval patrols, of bounties placed on our heads, of new tactics being developed to counter our raids. The easy targets were becoming scarce, and the remaining Roman ships were heavily defended. "They're adapting," Spartacus admitted during one of our council meetings. "Soon they'll stop sending individual ships and start using convoys with heavy military escorts. We need to evolve as well." "What do you have in mind?" Bran asked. Spartacus spread out a map of the Mediterranean on the rough wooden table. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot on the Italian coast. "The port of Ostia, Rome's main harbor, where grain ships from Egypt and North Africa bring food to feed the capital." I felt my blood chill. "You want to attack Rome itself?" "Not the city. The port. One decisive strike that cripples their supply lines and shows the world that Rome is not invincible. But it would require our entire fleet, and many of us would not return." The room fell silent as we contemplated the magnitude of what he was proposing. It was audacious beyond belief. A direct assault on the heart of Roman power. It would either be remembered as the greatest victory in the history of rebellion, or as a glorious suicide that accomplished nothing. "I need every ship captain to think carefully," Spartacus continued. "This is not a decision I can make alone. We are free men, and free men choose their own fate." As I walked back to my quarters that night, I knew what my answer would be. I had not escaped the furnaces of Populonia to hide on a safe island for the rest of my life. I had tasted freedom, and now I wanted to help others taste it too. Rome had made us into weapons in their forges of oppression. Now it was time to turn those weapons against our makers. The vote was unanimous. Every ship captain in our fleet chose to join the assault on Ostia. As I looked around the council chamber at the scarred faces of men who had endured every form of Roman cruelty, I saw not recklessness, but resolve. We had all passed the point where mere survival was enough. Then it's settled, Spartacus declared. In 2 days, when the moon is dark, we sail for Rome. The preparations were intense and sobering. Every weapon was sharpened, every piece of armor repaired. Men who had never spoken to each other shared their meager possessions, knowing that some would not return to claim them. Letters were written to loved ones left behind in distant lands, though none of us knew if those letters would ever be delivered. Bran took me aside as we loaded supplies onto our galley. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly. "We could still slip away, find passage to the Atlantic, and seek those legendary islands I told you about." I looked at him for a long moment. The big Celt had become more than a navigator to me. He was a brother, a friend who had saved my life more than once during our raids. The thought of losing him in the coming battle was almost unbearable. "Do you remember what you said when you first joined us?" I asked. "That you'd been a slave for 3 months too long." I remember. How many others are suffering those same 3 months right now? How many more will endure them if we don't act? Bran nodded slowly. "The chains we break today are the ones our grandchildren won't have to wear." Exactly. As dawn broke on the day of our departure, nearly 30 ships prepared to leave the safety of our hidden harbor. It was the largest fleet our rebellion had ever assembled. Galleys, merchant vessels converted to warships, even a few fishing boats crewed by men desperate enough to sail into the jaws of death for a chance at revenge. Spartacus addressed the entire fleet from the deck of his flagship, his voice carrying across the water to every vessel. "Brothers," he called out, "today we sail not as pirates or raiders, but as liberators. Every stroke of our oars brings us closer to Rome's heart. Every mile we travel brings freedom closer to 10,000 slaves, still in chains." A roar went up from the assembled crews. These weren't professional soldiers, but they had something the Romans didn't prize: the fury of the oppressed finally given a chance to strike back. The voyage to the Italian coast took 3 days of hard sailing. We hugged the shore of Sardinia for as long as possible, then struck out across the open sea toward our target. Roman patrol ships were spotted twice, but both times they withdrew rather than engage our overwhelming numbers. "They're probably racing ahead to warn Ostia," Cyclops observed, as we watched the second patrol disappear over the horizon. "Good," I replied. "Let them know we're coming. Fear is a weapon too." As we approached the Roman coastline, the true magnitude of our target became clear. Ostia wasn't just a port. It was a vast complex of harbors, warehouses, and fortifications that stretched for miles along the shore. Hundreds of ships crowded the multiple basins, their masts creating a forest of timber and rigging. There, Spartacus pointed to the largest harbor. "That's where the grain ships from Egypt dock. If we can destroy or capture those vessels, Rome's food supply will be crippled for months." But the Romans hadn't been idle. The harbor mouth was defended by 2 massive towers, each bristling with catapults and archers. A chain stretched between them, blocking access to the inner harbor, where the most valuable ships waited. "How do we get past that?" Brutus asked, studying the fortifications. "We don't," Spartacus replied with a grim smile. "We go through it." The attack began at dawn. While half our fleet approached the main harbor as a distraction, the rest of us struck at the smaller fishing ports along the coast. The plan was to spread the Roman defenders thin, forcing them to divide their attention. My ship was part of the main assault force. As we rowed toward the harbor mouth, catapult stones began crashing into the water around us. One stone took the mast off a ship to our left, sending rigging and sail tumbling into the sea. "All speed!" I shouted to our rowers. "The faster we move, the harder we are to hit." The chain across the harbor mouth was massive, each link as thick as a man's waist. But Spartacus had prepared for this obstacle. Several of our ships carried specially designed iron rams, forged in secret workshops from the weapons we'd captured in previous raids. The first ramming ship struck the chain at full speed. The impact was tremendous. The ship's bow crumbled, but the chain held. The second ship hit moments later, and this time I heard the groaning of stressed metal. The third ship finished the job, snapping the great chain and opening the way to the inner harbor. "Forward!" Spartacus roared from his flagship. Into the heart of Rome. What followed was chaos beyond imagination. Our ships poured into the harbor like wolves into a sheepfold. Roman merchant vessels, heavy with grain and other supplies, tried desperately to escape. Some ran aground in their panic. Others collided with each other in the narrow channels between the docks. I found myself leading a boarding party onto a massive grain ship. The crew put up fierce resistance. These weren't soldiers, but they fought like men defending their homes, which, in a way, Rome's survival depended on the supplies these ships carried. The battle raged for hours. We captured or destroyed dozens of ships, freed hundreds of slaves from the holds of captured vessels, and set fire to warehouses full of supplies destined for the capital. The smoke from our fires could be seen for miles, a black column rising into the sky like a funeral pyre for Roman invincibility. But our victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly half our fleet was lost. Ships burned, sunk, or captured by the Romans. Hundreds of our brothers died in the harbor waters or on the blood-soaked docks of Ostia. As we fought our way back to open sea with the remnants of our fleet, I saw Cyclops' ship falling behind. Flames licked at her hull, and she was listing badly to port. Through the smoke, I could see my one-eyed friend still at his post, directing his crew's desperate efforts to stay afloat. "We have to help them," I called to Bran, but even as I spoke, a Roman trireme emerged from the smoke and rammed Cyclops' damaged vessel amidships. The galley broke in half and sank within minutes. I never saw my friend again. That night, as the surviving ships of our fleet limped away from the Italian coast, I stood at the stern, looking back at the glow of fires still burning in Ostia's harbor. We had struck a blow that would be remembered for centuries, but the cost had been almost more than I could bear. "Was it worth it?" Bran asked quietly, joining me at the rail. I thought of Cyclops, of Brutus, of all the brave men who would never see another sunrise. Then I thought of the slaves we had freed, the supplies we had destroyed, the fear we had struck into Roman hearts. "Ask me in 10 years, I said, "when we see if anyone remembers what we did here." 10 years have passed since the Battle of Ostia, and I'm writing these words on an island so far from the Mediterranean that Roman charts don't even show it exists. Bran was right about those legendary lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. There are indeed places where the eagles of Rome have never flown. After Ostia, our rebellion scattered like seeds on the wind. Spartacus died in a final battle against a Roman fleet off the coast of Sicily. Surrounded by enemies but never surrendering, some of our surviving comrades found sanctuary in the mountains of Hispania. Others disappeared into the forests of Germania, but a few of us, led by Bran's steady navigation, sailed west into the unknown Atlantic. The voyage nearly killed us. Storms battered our single remaining ship for weeks, and we lost our way among fog-shrouded islands where strange birds cried out in the darkness. Half our crew died of fever and thirst before we finally sighted the green shores of this remote land. We weren't the first to arrive here. We found evidence of other visitors. Irish monks who had built a small monastery on the northern coast. Norse traders who had established a trading post that was already being reclaimed by the forest. But there were no Romans, no slaves, no chains. Just endless sky, clean water, and soil that had never been worked by forced labor. I've built a good life here. I married Cara, a woman from the Irish settlement who lost her own family to Viking raids. Our children have never seen a slave collar or heard the crack of an overseer's whip. They speak freely, dream freely, and will never know the weight of iron chains on their ankles. But even in this distant paradise, I sometimes dream of Populonia. I see the furnaces still burning, still consuming human lives to feed Rome's hunger for metal. I think of Cyclops, who died believing that our rebellion might inspire others. I wonder if he was right. News reaches us here, carried by the occasional Irish or Norse ship. Rome still stands, still conquers, still enslaves. But the stories also speak of other rebellions, Other men who chose to fight rather than submit. In Britannia, a queen named Boudica led her people against Roman rule. In Judea, zealots fought a desperate war in mountain fortresses. In Germania, tribes united to destroy entire Roman legions in the deep forests. Perhaps our raid on Ostia was just one spark in a fire that was always going to burn. Or perhaps it truly did inspire others to take up arms against oppression. I'll never know for certain, but I choose to believe that every act of resistance matters, no matter how small or how far from the centers of power. Yesterday, a ship arrived bearing disturbing news. A Roman expedition is being organized to explore the Western Ocean, to map new lands for potential conquest. The captain, a Greek merchant named Theodoros, warned us that it's only a matter of time before Rome's expansion reaches even these distant shores. The world isn't big enough to hide from Rome forever, he told me as we stood watching the sunset paint the sea crimson. They'll find you eventually. Let them come, I replied, feeling the familiar weight of the sword at my side. Not the crude weapon I'd made in Populonia, but a fine blade forged here in our own smithy. From iron we've mined and smelted, without slave labor. We know how to fight now. But tonight, as I finish writing this account, I'm thinking less about future battles and more about what we've built here, in this small settlement on the edge of the world. We've created something Rome can never understand. A community based on freedom rather than force, on cooperation rather than conquest. Our smithy produces tools and weapons, but also beautiful objects, made simply for the joy of creation. Our farmers grow food for everyone, not to feed distant masters. Our children learn to read and write, not to serve as scribes in Roman offices, but because knowledge is its own reward. This is what we were fighting for in the furnaces of Populonia, though we couldn't articulate it then. Not just freedom from slavery, but freedom to live as human beings should live, with dignity, with purpose, with hope for the future. If Rome does come to these shores, they'll find us ready, not just with swords and shields, but with something more powerful, the example of what the world could be if it wasn't built on chains and whips. I've taught my children the story of our rebellion, of Cyclops and Spartacus, and all the brave men who died for the dream of freedom. I want them to understand that liberty isn't a gift. It's something that must be won and defended by each generation. The iron we forge here serves life, not death. The fires we tend warm homes and cook food for families, instead of smelting weapons for conquest. And when I look at my children playing in the meadows above our harbor, I see the real victory of our rebellion. Not the ships we burned or the Romans we killed, but the free lives we made possible. The scars on my shoulder from Cyclops' branding iron have faded but never disappeared. Sometimes, in winter, when old wounds ache, I trace the mark with my fingers and remember the oath we swore in that abandoned furnace so long ago. I kept my word. I never betrayed my brothers. And in keeping faith with them, I found something I never expected to possess. Peace. The sun is setting now, painting the western sky the color of molten iron. But this is iron transformed. Not the harsh metal of swords and chains, but the gentle fire that promises another day of freedom. Tomorrow I'll work in my garden, teach my children, and help build a world where no one need fear the sound of marching legions or the crack of an overseer's whip. This is my victory over Rome. Not conquest, but creation. Not destruction, but the quiet triumph of a life lived free. By fire and iron, we were enslaved. By fire and iron, we won our freedom. And by fire and iron, the sacred fires of home and hearth, we keep it still. Asterisk. End of chronicle. Asterisk. Asterisk. These words were carved in stone and placed in the great hall of our settlement, so that future generations might remember the price of freedom and the courage of those who paid it. Asterisk.